the Wild West has always held a special place in our imagination. When we hear those words, we picture dusty trails, lone riders on horseback, and frontier towns where adventures seem to wait at every corner. But behind the legends, the tall tales, and the Hollywood movies, there lies a far more fascinating reality, one of grit, survival, and ordinary people trying to carve out a life in a land both beautiful and unforgiving. In this story, we're going to journey back in time, stepping into a world where every day was a gamble, and every decision could mean the difference between life and death. The Wild West was more than just duels at high noon or daring outlaw escapes. Hey, it was about endless stretches of desert where water was a treasure, mountains that stood like walls between travelers and their destination, and storms that could change everything in a heartbeat. It was a place where hope and hardship walked side by side. The pioneers who set out westward weren't searching for comfort. They were chasing opportunity, freedom, and sometimes simply survival. Their wagons creaked across the prairies, carrying families, dreams, and the weight of an uncertain future. Imagine stepping onto that dusty trail with nothing but a few supplies, faith in your own hands, and a determination to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. That was the reality of the frontier. But survival in the Wild West wasn't just about nature's challenges. It was about the people who lived there. Settlers, cowboys, Native American tribes, lawmen, outlaws, all of them played their part in shaping the story of the West. Each brought their own traditions, struggles, and resilience, creating a landscape not just of land and sky, but of human stories intertwined with conflict, cooperation, and the unyielding desire to endure. Today, we'll uncover not only the myths, but also the hidden truths. What was life really like for the men and women who lived through it? How did they face hunger, disease, and danger when help was miles away and survival depended on sheer willpower? What lessons can we learn from their endurance, their community spirit, and their ability to adapt to a world that often seemed determined to break them? If you've ever been fascinated by the old tales of the West, this journey will take you beyond the surface to the grit, the dust, and the unspoken realities. Together, we'll explore the survival strategies that kept pioneers alive, the resilience of frontier families, and the ways in which the Wild West shaped not just a region, but an entire identity. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to join our community here. If you enjoy stories of history, survival, and the hidden truths behind legends, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, To truly understand the heart of the Wild West, one must imagine what it meant to step into a land that seemed to stretch endlessly. With horizons so wide, they made a person feel both small and limitless at the same time. 'Cause in that vastness lay the essence of freedom, a kind of freedom that was not simply about doing as one pleased, but about carrying the weight of choices, carving out a place in the unknown, and daring to shape a future from nothing but dust, sky, and determination. That sense of liberty was intoxicating for many who left behind crowded cities and familiar lives, believing that somewhere out in the open plains, along the winding rivers, or in the shadow of towering mountains, they could build something entirely their own, untouched by the rules and restraints of the world they had known before. Yet, with that freedom came a risk so immense that every step forward felt like a wager with fate, because survival in the frontier was not guaranteed by courage alone, but demanded strength, resourcefulness, and often a willingness to endure hardships that tested the very core of human endurance. The land was both a giver and a taker, offering opportunities for farming, hunting, and trade, but also presenting droughts, floods, storms, endless challenges that could strip a family of everything in a single day. Every decision carried weight. Choosing the wrong path across the desert could mean thirst and loss. Planting crops too late in the season could bring hunger, and trusting the wrong companion could endanger more than just dreams. In this way, risk was woven into the very fabric of the Wild West, creating a life where nothing was certain, but everything was possible. And yet, it was precisely this balance between freedom and danger that shaped the remarkable resilience of those who dared to call the frontier home. Resilience was not an abstract idea, but something forged daily in the hands of mothers who raised children in cabins far from neighbors, in the determination of men who rebuilt barns destroyed by storms, in the courage of communities that stood together against hardship, and in the quiet persistence of those who refused to give up even when the odds were stacked against them. Each sunrise was not just another day, but a silent victory, proof that despite all obstacles, they had endured, and that endurance carried within it a strength that still resonates through the stories of the West today. For the settlers, the cowboys, the traders, the countless others who ventured across that vast expanse, the Wild West was never just a place on a map, it was a test, a proving ground where freedom demanded sacrifice, risk offered both ruin and reward, and resilience became the thread that held life together in a world. When we look back on the Wild West through the lens of films and novels, we often see a world painted with a certain glow, where lone gunslingers ride into town, justice is served with a quick draw, and every sunset feels like the closing scene of a grand adventure. Yet this romantic picture, while captivating, is only a shadow of the truth, because the reality of life on the frontier was far less glamorous and far more demanding, marked not by constant adventure, but by relentless labor, uncertainty, and the quiet endurance of countless individuals whose names history rarely remembers. The silver screen gave us outlaws with charisma, sheriffs who stood tall in dusty streets, and cowboys who seemed untouchable. But those stories rarely spoke of the endless hunger, the freezing nights spent without shelter, or the gnawing fear of disease that could spread through a camp and leave devastation behind before help could ever arrive. For the men and women who lived at the West was not a stage for theatrics, but a struggle where every day brought new trials, and there was no guarantee that hard work would be rewarded with comfort or success. Imagine a family settling on the edge of the prairie, their small home built from logs or sod, their dreams tied to a field that might yield a harvest if the rains came, or might turn to dust if the sun refused to relent, and realize that no script could ever capture the weight of such uncertainty. Even those who sought fortune in gold or silver discovered that the glittering promise of riches was more often a mirage, with the mines swallowing lives faster than they produced wealth, and those who struck it rich usually being the exception rather than the rule. The hardships extended beyond nature itself, for in towns that sprang up almost overnight, law and order were fragile things, and though movies often portray a single sheriff keeping peace with a firm hand in truth, many communities were left to govern themselves, relying on fragile alliances and the hope that neighbors would look out for one another. Conflict was never far, whether sparked by competition for resources, disputes over land, or the inevitable clash between newcomers and the native peoples who had called these lands home for centuries. To survive in such a world required not only physical toughness, but also emotional endurance, the kind of quiet resilience that does not make for dramatic scenes in theaters, but which defined the true spirit of the frontier far more than any staged gunfight ever could. So, while the romantic image of the Wild West continues to dazzle us with its sense of daring adventure, dawn, the truth was far grittier, filled with moments of loneliness, loss, and perseverance. A story not of constant glory, but of ordinary people confronting extraordinary challenges, and finding ways, however small, to endure. For those who chose to make the West their home, survival was not an abstract idea or a theme for a story told years later. It was the daily reality that shaped every decision, every movement, and every breath they took. 'Cause in a land that was vast, unpredictable, and unforgiving, Even the smallest misstep could mean the difference between seeing another sunrise or facing an early grave. Settlers woke each morning with the weight of uncertainty pressing down upon them, knowing that a single storm could destroy their crops, a sudden illness could sweep through their family, or an accident during work could change their lives forever. And there were no safety nets, no nearby hospitals, no instant communication to call for help, only the fragile bond of community and the sheer determination to endure. The simplest aspects of life carried enormous challenges. Water, for example, was not something that flowed endlessly from a tap, but a treasure that had to be found, carried and preserved, often at great risk and with great effort, because without it, neither people, livestock, nor crops could survive. Food was another constant concern, as hunting did not guarantee success. Farming demanded relentless labor with no promise of a harvest, and preservation methods like salting, smoking, or drying were imperfect, leaving families vulnerable when supplies ran short. Illness added another layer of danger, because without the knowledge of modern medicine, something as simple as a fever or an infected cut could spread quickly and become fatal, and the remedies available were as likely to worsen the situation as they were to provide relief. The physical environment itself seemed determined to test the limits of human endurance. Summer scorched the land until it cracked, leaving settlers desperate for shade that rarely existed on open prairies, while winters could drop temperatures so low that frostbite set in before dawn. Inside their homes, if one could even call them, that comfort was minimal. A cabin made from rough-hewn logs, or sometimes even sod pulled from the earth, offered little protection against the howling winds or the searing sun, and every creak of the wood or whistle of the wind reminded them just how thin the barrier was between themselves and the vast indifferent wilderness beyond their walls. Animals, too, presented dangers in unexpected ways. Horse could mean life itself, carrying a person across miles of emptiness or pulling wagons laden with supplies, but one misstep, one stumble, one kick could cripple or kill both animal and rider. Predators roamed the frontier as well, and though many were more wary of humans than humans were of them, the possibility of an encounter with wolves, cougars, or bears added a quiet tension to every journey beyond the safety of camp. Even to truly understand the weight of life on the frontier, one must first grasp how profoundly the land itself dictated every choice, every hardship, and every fleeting moment of relief, for the landscapes of the American West were not merely a backdrop against which stories unfolded. They were the central force shaping the destiny of those who dared to settle there. Endless stretches of prairie, with grass swaying like an ocean beneath the vast sky, might look serene at a distance, but for those living upon it, that openness was both a blessing and a curse, offering fertile ground in good years, yet leaving families utterly exposed to merciless winds, sudden storms, and the isolation that came with horizons stretching farther than the eye could see. Mountains, majestic and immovable, promised resources in their veins of ore and timber from their forests, yet crossing them meant days of brutal climbing, thin air that left travelers gasping, and trails where a single misstep could send wagon or rider tumbling into the abyss below. The deserts, meanwhile, stripped away every illusion of safety or abundance, demanding constant vigilance against thirst, for waterholes could vanish without warning, leaving both people and animals staggering beneath the unrelenting sun. Nights in those same deserts brought an equally punishing chill, as though the land itself sought to remind settlers that comfort was a luxury it would not grant. Rivers, when they appeared, were as likely to bring destruction as salvation, swelling without warning into floods that swept away crops, homes, and lives, and in quieter times, requiring dangerous crossings that could turn a journey into tragedy within moments. Forests offered shade, wood, and game, yet they also concealed predators, outlaws, and the constant threat of fire, a spark turning dense growth into an unstoppable blaze that devoured everything in its path. Everywhere, The land reminded settlers of its supremacy. Its oil could shift from nourishing to barren without explanation. Rains could bless one valley while skipping another entirely. And storms seemed to rise from nowhere, tearing roofs from cabins, flattening fences, and leaving behind scars on both earth and spirit. The seasons themselves were relentless taskmasters. Spring brought mud that trapped wagons and delayed planting. Summer punished with heat and swarms of biting insects. Autumn demanded exhausting labor to harvest before frost, and winter cloaked everything in ice, where even the simple act of drawing breath felt like a battle against the elements. Oh, for the people who endured it, the landscape was not just scenery. It was an adversary, a teacher, and sometimes, though rarely, a source of profound beauty that reminded them why they had come in the first place. Standing at dawn. In the heart of the frontier, one of the most relentless and unforgiving challenges settlers faced was the desert. An expanse so vast and so deceptively beautiful that it seemed almost surreal at first glance. With rolling dunes, sun-bleached plains, and the occasional hardy shrub standing defiantly against the relentless sun. Yet, beneath its quiet majesty lay an environment that could strip life down to its most basic struggle within hours. Because here, water was no longer merely a convenience, but the defining force of existence. The very element that separated survival from tragedy. And one's ability to find it often dictated the success or failure of an entire journey. The scarcity of water shaped every decision. How far to travel each day, how to ration supplies, and how to choose routes that might promise life-giving streams while avoiding stretches of parched, lifeless sand that could easily become a death trap under the blazing sun. For travelers and settlers alike, every water source was precious, sometimes hidden beneath rocky outcrops at the bottom of dry riverbeds, or concealed by the undulating terrain until exhaustion forced the weary eyes to spot it at the last possible moment. And even when found, the water was rarely abundant, often muddy or stagnant, carrying the ever-present risk of illness, but still indispensable, because without it, humans and animals alike would falter. Weakened by heat, sunburn, and the endless demand of labor in a place that gave nothing freely, caravans moving through these regions learned to travel light, conserve energy, and endure discomfort with a stoicism born of necessity. Each day, a careful negotiation with the desert that demanded respect, patience, and an almost instinctual understanding of the land's hidden rhythms. Yet, the desert's cruelty did not end with the sun. Nights, which might seem like a reprieve, often brought chilling cold, sharp enough to bite through clothing and blankets, leaving families and travelers shivering, ill-prepared for the extremes of a land that gave no quarter, and forcing them to improvise shelters from canvas, wood, or earth, doing whatever they could to hold on to warmth and survive the hours until dawn brought the sun's blistering rays once again. Travelers learned that even the animals they relied upon were affected. Horses, mules, and oxen could falter under the heat or fail to find enough water, leaving their human companions stranded and vulnerable, dependent on both skill and sheer luck to continue the journey. It is within these deserts that the harsh reality of the frontier became most apparent. Survival was never a certainty, only a fragile daily accomplishment earned through endurance, ingenuity, and a relentless refusal to give. As the desert finally gave way to the looming silhouette of the Rocky Mountains, travelers often felt a mixture of awe and dread, because these towering peaks, majestic and seemingly eternal, promised both the hope of new opportunities and the very real threat of peril that could turn a journey into a nightmare in an instant. And unlike the open plains where the eye could always anticipate the horizon, the mountains presented sudden drops, jagged cliffs, narrow passes, and dense forests that seemed to close in around even the most experienced wanderers, demanding constant vigilance and every ounce of strength and skill one could summon. The rocky terrain was unforgiving. Wagons laden with families and supplies had to be carefully guided over uneven paths where a single misstep could snap an axle, top a cargo, or send both human and animal tumbling down a slope that offered no mercy. And every stream crossing could turn into a treacherous gamble, as ice-cold water swept away tools, provisions, or the unlucky traveler unprepared for the current. For those venturing into the highlands, altitude added another invisible danger. The air thinned with each climb, leaving lungs gasping and muscles trembling from exertion. And what might have been a manageable day's journey on lower ground could stretch into an exhausting ordeal that tested endurance to its absolute limits. Storms, often unpredictable in these mountains, struck without warning, bringing sudden blizzards in the dead of winter, or torrential rains in summer that transformed trails into slippery, muddy hazards where footing was uncertain and the risk of hypothermia or injury loomed with every step. Travelers quickly learned that survival here required more than physical strength, demanded careful planning, adaptability, and a constant awareness of one's surroundings. It's because the mountains had little patience for mistakes, and the consequences of overconfidence were often severe. Wildlife, too, contributed to the danger of the Rockies. Bears emerged from hidden valleys, startled by human presence, and ready to defend their territory, while cougars prowled the shadows, silent yet deadly, forcing travelers to remain ever alert even in seemingly safe clearings. Wolves could strike at livestock, leaving a family not only hungry but dangerously exposed if their animals were lost. And venomous snakes could hide among the rocks, delivering bites that, without prompt medical attention, could prove fatal. Even the flora itself posed risks, as certain plants could cause illness if consumed in ignorance, and the rugged forests concealed pitfalls and hidden ravines that could swallow the unwary in a heartbeat. Beyond the physical threats, the mountains also tested the spirit. Isolation became pronounced in ways unimaginable to someone accustomed to towns, neighbors, or steady communication. One miscalculation could leave travelers stranded for days, dependent on their own knowledge, intuition, and stamina to find the next pass, the next source of water, or the next patch of edible vegetation. Nights brought a cold, so deep it seeped into bones, and the quiet, immense expanse of rock and sky pressed upon the mind with a weight that made the smallest discomfort or error feel monumental. Yet, even as travelers crested the ridges of the Rocky Mountains or navigated the deserts and plains beyond, another challenge awaited that was as merciless and uncontrollable as the land itself: the weather, which seemed to operate by its own inscrutable rules, indifferent to human plans or preparations, capable of turning the most carefully charted journey into a desperate struggle for survival within hours. In the west, the sky could shift from brilliant blue to ominous gray in a matter of moments, and those clouds, light and drifting one minute, could gather suddenly into thunderstorms that rattled wagons, pounded shelters with sheets of rain, and turned familiar paths into quagmires where every step was uncertain and every decision carried heightened risk. Snowstorms, too, could strike without warning, dumping inches of snow upon already treacherous terrain, freezing rivers, and coating trails in ice, while icy winds cut through clothing and blankets alike, leaving travelers shivering, weary, and painfully aware that one miscalculation or delay could leave them stranded, far from help, forced to endure the night with only the meager protection of a cabin, a tent, or the open wilderness itself. And just as suddenly as winter storms could arrive, summer could assert itself with an equally punishing hand, bringing relentless heat that baked the earth beneath the wheels of wagons, dried up rivers, and left both humans and animals exhausted and desperate for relief. The sun in the west was not gentle. It beat down with intensity that made even the simplest tasks, fetching water, tending animals, repairing equipment, feel like feats of strength and endurance, while the dry, parched air sucked moisture from skin, cracked lips, and left travelers constantly thirsty despite the water they carried. Drought could linger for weeks, turning once fertile fields into barren dust bowls, and even the smallest breeze offered little comfort against the unforgiving rays of the sun or the weight of the heat, pressing down on shoulders already burdened by wagons, livestock, and supplies. The unpredictability of the weather added a layer of psychological strain that was perhaps as severe as the physical challenges themselves, 'cause no amount of planning could fully account for the sudden arrival of a blizzard, the unrelenting sun of mid-July, or the flash floods that roared down narrow valleys without warning. Travelers had to become constantly vigilant, reading the clouds, the wind, and the subtle shifts in the air, learning over time to anticipate changes that could determine whether a family would reach safety or become yet another cautionary tale whispered around frontier fires. Nightfall did not always bring relief either, as the desert chill, mountain frost, or humid summer evenings carried their own dangers. From frostbite to heat stroke, each demanding vigilance, even in sleep. In this way, the weather of the Wild West was not merely a backdrop for daily life, but an omnipresent force that shaped behavior, dictated movement, and measured endurance, teaching settlers that the environment could be as deadly as any outlaw or predator, and that survival required not only physical strength and courage, but also keen observation, adaptability, and a profound respect for the forces of nature that, beyond the challenges of harsh landscapes and unpredictable weather, settlers faced a struggle even more immediate and constant, the relentless uncertainty of food, which, in the Wild West, was never a guarantee, never a simple convenience, but a daily concern that demanded foresight, resourcefulness, and an almost constant negotiation with both the land and circumstance. Because whether one survived a week, a month, or a year often depended on what could be hunted, foraged, or cultivated in a land that offered no assurances. Meals were dictated by the seasons, by the success or failure of crops, and by the presence or absence of game. And in many cases, what a family ate one day could vanish entirely the next due to spoilage, predation, or natural disaster, leaving empty larders and hungry mouths staring back at weary parents who had already labored from dawn until dusk to secure sustenance. Staples like beans, salted pork, and hard biscuits were often the backbone of a frontier diet. Practical because they could be stored for long periods and transported on wagons, kept monotonous and far from nutritionally complete, leading to deficiencies, fatigue, and long-term health consequences. But settlers had little choice, for fresh food was a luxury, dependent on luck, location, the timing of the seasons. Hunting offered the promise of fresh meat, yet it was unpredictable, fraught with danger. This required skill, patience, and stamina, because game could be scarce, wary, or located far from home. And a failed hunt could leave a family hungry for days. Fishing in rivers or streams provided some relief, but even that relied on knowledge of waters that could change with the weather. In winter months, ice-covered lakes and frozen streams rendered this resource largely inaccessible. Preservation of food added yet another layer of labor, as settlers spent hours salting, smoking, or drying meat to ensure it lasted, often in rudimentary conditions that invited spoilage or contamination. And while these methods allowed survival over weeks or months, they came at the cost of flavor, variety, and in some cases, health, because excessive salt or improperly cured meat could lead to digestive problems or malnutrition. For families with children, the stakes were even higher, as young bodies required sufficient nutrition to grow and endure the physical demands of frontier life. Yet, those needs were often impossible to meet fully, leaving mothers and fathers constantly calculating rations, adjusting meals, and improvising recipes from what little was available, all while hoping that the next day's hunt harvest, or delivery from a distant store, would provide enough to sustain their family. Even in towns where trading posts or small stores existed, supplies were far from reliable. Roads were rough and often impassable. Wagons could be delayed for weeks by storms or broken equipment, and price fluctuations meant that food, when available, could be exorbitantly expensive for families scraping by on the meager earnings of farming, mining, or ranching. Starvation was not a distant threat in the imagination of settlers. Even when families or solitary travelers attempted to supplement their meager rations through hunting, they quickly learned that this was no simple or reliable solution. For hunting on the frontier demanded not only patience and skill, but also an almost constant awareness of chance and circumstance, because the wilderness, while abundant with game, offered no guarantees and punished overconfidence with swift and often brutal lessons. A successful hunt required the ability to read the land as much as the animals themselves, understanding the subtle signs of tracks, the disturbed brush that hinted at movement, the sounds carried on the wind that could signal a nearby herd or predator, and even the time of day, which could dictate the likelihood of encountering deer, elk, rabbits, or other creatures essential for sustenance. It was a dance with nature, one that required experience, quiet observation, and a deep respect for the unpredictable rhythms of the wilderness, because a misjudged step could scatter prey for days or even weeks, leaving a family to rely solely on preserved food or whatever meager crops might have survived weather. Luck, too, played a role that no amount of skill could entirely control. A sudden storm could drive game away, an errant bullet could miss its mark, or a wounded animal could vanish into the underbrush, leaving the hunter exhausted, frustrated, and empty-handed. Sometimes, after hours of tracking that had demanded more energy and focus than a full day of farm labor, even when game was successfully brought down, was only the beginning of another trial: cleaning, preserving, and transporting meat over rough terrain without refrigeration, where spoilage could set in within hours in summer heat or damage supplies during sudden rain. Animals themselves could be dangerous, from charging deer and startled bears to venomous snakes hidden in the brush, forcing hunters to combine caution with courage. And each encounter carried the quiet reminder that in the West, life and death often hung on decisions made in mere moments. Hunting was as much a mental exercise as it was physical, because settlers had to balance the immediate need for nourishment against the long-term sustainability of their environment, recognizing that overhunting or careless pursuit could deplete game in an area, leaving families vulnerable in the days or weeks to come. It was a test of foresight, patience, and endurance, requiring the kind of observation and problem-solving that transformed ordinary survival into an intricate, almost intimate engagement with the natural world, where every rustle of leaves, every broken twig, every distant shadow became a clue, a challenge, or a warning. Success brought not only food, but a sense of accomplishment and relief. Yet failure, which was all too common, reinforced the precariousness of life on the frontier, teaching settlers, over and over, that sustenance was never guaranteed, that the wilderness was an equal partner in their struggle, and that resilience and adaptability were as crucial as marksmanship, stealth, or physical strength in the even for those settlers who turned their focus from hunting to the laborious task of farming. Life on the frontier offered little reprieve, because the land that appeared vast and fertile at a glance often concealed soils that were stubborn, rocky, or deficient in essential nutrients, demanding relentless effort merely to coax a meager yield. And even then, success was never assured. Farmers would rise before dawn, their hands already blistered and calloused from previous days, only to spend hours tilling the earth with primitive plows drawn by oxen or horses, often struggling to break through compacted ground roots or hidden stones that threatened to damage equipment or halt progress altogether. And every furrow turned felt like a negotiation with the stubborn terrain itself, each planting season a careful gamble against forces beyond their control. Droughts could arrive without warning, leaving fields parched and cracked, the fragile seeds sown with so much hope lying dormant in the sun-baked soil, while the crops of previous weeks withered away, their promise evaporating under relentless heat. Conversely, sudden storms could wash away freshly planted seeds, drown tender shoots, and erode the thin topsoil settlers had painstakingly cultivated. leaving families to begin again with little more than exhaustion and resolve to sustain them. Irrigation systems, when available, were rudimentary and labor-intensive, requiring the construction of ditches, canals, and channels by hand, and even then, water could be scarce or misdirected by the uneven terrain, testing both ingenuity and patience in equal measure. Livestock, while essential for sustenance and labor, added another layer of unpredictability and responsibility, as cows, pigs, chickens, horses needed constant attention, protection from predators, and careful management to prevent disease, all while requiring fodder that was itself dependent on the success of a farmer's often fragile crops. One night of theft, predation, or illness could undo weeks of work, leaving families hungry and overburdened, and there was little room for error. For every loss threatened not just their immediate survival, but their ability to endure through the coming months and harsh seasons ahead. Even more, the physical toll of farming under these conditions was relentless. Men, women, and often children labored from sunup to sundown, with few breaks, enduring the relentless sun, biting insects and the back-breaking demands of plowing, planting, weeding, and harvesting, while carrying the constant mental weight of uncertainty. Would the harvest survive? Would the animals remain healthy? Would they have enough food and water to see another month, another season, another year? The frontier farm was not a sanctuary or a guarantee of comfort. It was a battlefield of endurance, patience, and sheer perseverance, where success was measured not in abundance, but in the quiet triumph of having survived, even minimally, against the formidable obstacles of soil, climate, and the unyielding hand of nature itself. Yet even after settlers had tilled the stubborn soil, hunted for their sustenance, and endured the relentless unpredictability of weather, another visible threat loomed, one that few could fully prepare for, and that demanded vigilance as keen as any physical challenge the frontier presented. Disease, which spread quickly, silently, and often lethally through towns, homesteads, and traveling groups alike, leaving devastation in its wake and exposing the stark reality that in the Wild West, survival was not only a test of strength, endurance, and skill, but also of vulnerability to forces entirely beyond human control. Medical knowledge was rudimentary at best, and the practices that did exist were often as dangerous as the illnesses they aimed to treat. Bloodletting, purgatives, and potions of dubious efficacy were common, and even a simple infection from a scratch or a minor wound could spiral into a life-threatening condition with no FFECTIV treatment available. Communities were isolated, and professional doctors were few and far between, leaving families reliant on local midwives, herbal remedies, or whatever folk knowledge had been passed down, which, while occasionally helpful, often provided only partial relief, temporary comfort, or, in some cases, harm. Epidemics such as cholera, smallpox, typhoid, and tuberculosis could sweep through a settlement in weeks, claiming lives indiscriminately and leaving survivors grappling with grief, fear, and the harsh reality that proximity to others, which was necessary for cooperation and survival, could also be a source of deadly vulnerability. Even minor illnesses that today would be considered routine fevers, gastrointestinal distress, or respiratory infections could incapacitate a family for days or weeks, halting work in fields, mines, or ranches, while nutrition, already scarce, deteriorated further under the strain of sickness. Children were particularly vulnerable and infant mortality rates were high, a cruel reminder that the frontier spared few no matter age or circumstance, and that daily life was a continuous negotiation with unseen threats as much as with the tangible hardships of land, water, and weather. Travel between settlements carried its own risks, as disease could spread along wagon trails or through communal spaces such as trading posts, saloons, and churches, turning even ordinary interactions into potential hazards. Towns themselves were often crowded, with poor sanitation compounding the danger. Waste disposal was rudimentary. Water sources could be contaminated, and understanding of germs and infection was limited, creating an environment where illness was almost an expected companion, lurking in shadows, corners, and every crowded space. Even with knowledge, skill, and constant attention, settlers lived under the persistent awareness that health was fragile, and that no amount of preparation could guarantee. Even when settlers managed to avoid the invisible threats of disease that swept unpredictably through towns and homesteads, they faced a constant, ever-present danger that lurked in every daily task and journey across the frontier. The risk of injury, which in the Wild West could escalate from a minor inconvenience to a life-threatening event in the blink of an eye, because proper medical care was scarce, rudimentary at best, and often entirely absent, leaving even the simplest accident, tan axe slip while chopping firewood, a fall from a horse, or a misstep while carrying supplies over rocky terrains, potentially fatal. Unlike today, where hospitals, emergency responders, and antibiotics can turn near disasters into minor stories, settlers had little more than grasped their own knowledge, the advice of neighbors, and whatever makeshift remedies they could devise from herbs, alcohol, or old wives' tales, and in many cases, these treatments were inadequate, dangerous, or worse, exacerbated the injury. The physical labor required to farm, hunt, build cabins, or tend livestock amplified these risks daily, because each task demanded strength, precision, and endurance, and one miscalculation could result in broken bones, steep cuts, or crushed limbs, injuries that modern medicine could quickly mend, but that on the frontier often festered into infection, gangrene, or systemic illness. Even something as simple as a wagon accident could prove catastrophic. A wheel breaking mid-journey, an axle snapping on uneven ground, or a horse bolting unexpectedly could send travelers tumbling, kin to rocks, ravines, or water, with no immediate aid and no guarantee that companions could safely extract them before exposure, blood loss, or shot claimed another victim. Accidents involving animals were equally perilous. Livestock might kick, bite, or trample. A handler, while hunting or defending the homestead, could bring settlers face to face with unpredictable wildlife, from startled deer and bison to snakes and predatory carnivores, each encounter carrying the potential for severe injury. Even minor wounds were fraught with danger because the risk of infection was high. Antiseptics were rudimentary or unavailable. Cane germs were poorly understood, meaning a simple scratch could spiral into a condition that left a person incapacitated for days or weeks, threatening not only their own survival, but the livelihood and safety of their family, who relied on them for labor and protection. In this way, life on the frontier demanded constant attention to both action and environment, where every movement held potential peril, and every day was a test of vigilance, skill, and endurance, teaching settlers to respect the fragility of the human body as much as the unpredictability of the land. Beyond the invisible threats of disease and the ever-present danger of accidents, another layer of peril hung over the lives of settlers, miners, and travelers alike, one that was as human as it was unpredictable. The violence and lawlessness that permeated many frontier towns is transforming what might otherwise have been modest settlements into spaces where every encounter carried a subtle tension, and where trust had to be measured as carefully as the distance between yourself and a loaded revolver. Because in a place where official authority was often weak, inconsistent, or entirely absent, personal defense, negotiation, and the constant awareness of potential threats became everyday necessities rather than extraordinary precautions. The very streets themselves could tell stories of conflict, where saloons served not only as social hubs, but as stages for heated arguments that might escalate into duels, barroom brawls, or worse, and where rumors of outlaw gangs, bandit raids, and petty thefts circulated alongside announcements of town meetings or church gatherings, blending daily life with an undercurrent of danger that required settlers to navigate each interaction with vigilance, intuition, and an awareness that missteps could have swift, irreversible consequences. Lawmen, when present, were often few in number and faced the near impossible task of enforcing rules across vast, sprawling settlements where neighbors could be friends one day and adversaries the next, and where disputes over property, livestock, water, or even personal honor could erupt into violent confrontations, sometimes drawing the attention of the entire town. Gunfights, while not as ubiquitous as Hollywood legends suggest, did occur, often sparked by refusal to comply with ordinances, personal vendettas, or the reckless impulses of those who saw opportunity in the chaos. In towns such as Dodge City, Tombstone, and Deadwood became infamous not merely for the drama of legendary showdowns, but for the everyday reality that survival in these communities required both courage and cunning, a readiness to defend oneself at a moment's notice, and a constant mental ledger of allies, enemies, and unpredictable variables. Even seemingly mundane spaces, the marketplace, the post office, or a simple trail connecting settlements could harbor threats as outlaws and opportunists exploited isolation, limited law enforcement, the essential need for travel and trade, turning ordinary journeys into exercises in caution and preparedness. Families and individuals learned quickly to establish routines, watch for warning signs, and carry weapons, not for sport, but for survival. While settlers' sense of community often relied as much on mutual protection and shared vigilance as on friendship or neighborly goodwill, violence was interwoven into the social fabric of frontier life, shaping behavior, influencing decisions, and instilling a resilience born not of desire but of necessity. Because in a world where law could be delayed, amidst the already precarious tapestry of frontier life, settlers often found themselves entangled in conflicts that were as complex and unpredictable as the land itself, where the boundaries between friend and foe could blur in an instant, and where survival demanded a keen understanding of both human nature and the delicate, often tense relationships that shaped the West. The clash of cultures, ambitions, and necessity created an environment in which encounters with outlaws, wandering settlers, and Native American communities were not merely incidental, but often central to the daily experience of frontier living, because every interaction carried weight. In every decision, whether to negotiate, confront, or withdraw, determine life or death, prosperity or ruin. Outlaws were not just figures of legend. They were real, opportunistic individuals who exploited the isolation of settlements, the difficulty of communication, and the slow reach of law enforcement, striking at traders, miners, and families with robbery, intimidation, or violence, often leaving chaos in their wake and forcing settlers to remain perpetually alert, armed, and strategic in the simplest acts of travel or commerce. Meanwhile, Native American communities faced the relentless encroachment of settlers on their lands, often resulting in tension, skirmishes, and tragic clashes. Centuries-old ways of life collided with the unyielding push of expansion. Treaties that were frequently broken or misunderstood, and the sometimes violent enforcement of laws that prioritized settlement over coexistence. Yet the reality was more nuanced than tales of good versus evil suggest. Many interactions between settlers and Native Americans involved trade, guidance, and mutual assistance, with tribes offering knowledge of terrain, hunting, and river crossings, helping newcomers survive conditions they would otherwise find insurmountable, while still defending their lands and resources when threatened. The frontier became a place where diplomacy, deception, alliance, and confrontation coexisted in a fragile balance, and settlers, who understood only part of this complex social web, risked failure, exploitation, or violence. Families learned to negotiate this world, carefully cultivating relationships with some groups while avoiding the ire of others, adapting to constantly shifting power dynamics, and developing an acute awareness that survival often depended as much on human strategy and cultural sensitivity as on physical endurance or skill with weapons. Even minor misunderstandings could escalate, turning a routine encounter into a dangerous confrontation. And the reputations of individuals and communities were fragile, shaped by rumor, precedent, and perception as much as by deeds. In this crucible of tension, every traveler, miner, and homesteader became a participant in a larger story of negotiation and conflict, story that demanded vigilance, respect, and resilience, because the frontier was not merely a stage for personal adventure, but a dynamic, often volatile intersection of cultures, ambitions, and survival imperatives, where the choices made in moments of uncertainty could echo across lives, families, communities, leaving legacies of courage, tragedy, and hard-earned wisdom that would define the experience of the American West for generations to come. In a world where threats lurked at every turn, both from the land and from human hands, settlers quickly learned that firearms were far more than instruments of sport or symbols of authority. They were essential tools for survival, woven into the very fabric of daily life in the Wild West. Because the line between routine activity and life-or-death encounter was so thin that being unarmed could mean the difference between safely turning home or becoming just another cautionary tale whispered around the campfire. Every homestead, mining camp, and wagon train was equipped with rifles, revolvers, and shotguns, not as a statement of bravado, but as a practical necessity, a way to defend oneself against predators, outlaws, or unexpected confrontations, while also serving a crucial role in securing food. Through hunting, which, as settlers knew all too well, was never guaranteed, the skillful handling of a firearm could determine whether a man or woman brought home a deer to feed a family for a week or returned tainted to face hunger, just as it could mean fending off a wolf pack, a mountain lion, or a surprise attack from a hostile party. Cause the frontier offered no guarantees, and every day demanded readiness, precision, and constant vigilance. Guns were a direct extension of human survival instinct, tools that required both technical skill and psychological fortitude, teaching settlers to balance caution with decisiveness, patience with quick reflexes, and courage with strategic thinking, because hesitation or error could prove fatal in moments measured not by hours but by seconds. Yet the presence of firearms did not create safety in a vacuum. It introduced a delicate calculus of trust, responsibility, and social navigation. As the misuse or careless handling of a weapon could escalate tensions, ignite disputes, or trigger violence that might have been avoided through diplomacy, awareness, or restraint. In towns with ordinances regulating weapon possession, the surrender or storage of firearms became a test of adaptability and foresight, requiring individuals to adjust to new rules while still preparing for the unpredictability of life just beyond the town limits, where danger might strike without warning and help was often too far away to arrive in time. Beyond immediate protection, guns also shaped the culture of the frontier, influencing everything from social interactions to economic activity, because they were a symbol of agency, a means to exert control in an environment where autonomy could easily be challenged by nature, circumstance, or human conflict. Families taught children from an early age how to handle firearms responsibly, how to read the terrain for threats, and how to respect both. Amid the constant threats posed by disease, injury, unpredictable weather, and human conflict, settlers quickly learned that survival was rarely an individual endeavor. For in the unforgiving expanse of the frontier, the strength of a community's networks of trust, cooperation, and shared knowledge often determined whether a family or a settlement could endure or succumb to the harsh realities around them. And those who underestimated the value of human connection risked isolation that could prove fatal. Neighbors depended on one another for far more than casual companionship. They shared labor in building homes, cultivating fields, tending livestock, and securing clean water. and they pooled resources to withstand famines, droughts, or unexpected calamities, recognizing that a single pair of hands, no matter how strong or skilled, could rarely meet the demands imposed by the land, the climate, and the constant unpredictability of frontier life. Even beyond the practical tasks of daily survival, community bonds provided emotional sustenance in a world where loneliness, fear, and uncertainty were constant companions, because settlers who faced illness, injury, or loss alone often found themselves overwhelmed, whereas those embedded in a supportive network could rely on others for care, guidance, and encouragement, creating a resilience that was as much social and psychological as it was physical. Stories, traditions, and warnings passed between neighbors became a living curriculum, teaching newcomers which plants were safe to eat, which trails were dangerous, how to predict weather patterns, and even how to navigate interactions with Native American tribes or wary travelers, transforming communal knowledge into a collective survival strategy that transcended generations. Shared rituals, gathering for communal meals, attending church services, celebrating seasonal milestones, or simply exchanging news around a fire afford moments of reprieve, connection, and reassurance, reinforcing the sense that even in a place defined by isolation and peril, human beings were capable of creating pockets of safety, solidarity, and mutual dependence. In emergencies, these bonds were often the difference between life and death. Neighbors could rally to help a family after a barn burn, assist in delivering a child in difficult conditions, or organize protection against threats from outlaws or predators, demonstrating that the frontier, despite its lawlessness and harshness, in the vast and often unforgiving expanse of the frontier, the concept of neighborly support went far beyond casual courtesy or occasional visits. It became the very lifeline that allowed families to endure the relentless challenges of everyday life, because in a land where the weather could turn vicious without warning, where disease and injury were constant threats, and where food could disappear as quickly as it was gathered, the ability to rely on others was not a luxury, but an absolute necessity, woven into the very routines of survival. Settlers shared what little they had: grain, salted meat, flour, and preserved fruits, knowing that generosity today might be repaid in kind tomorrow, not merely as a matter of morality, but as a practical strategy to ensure that no one perished alone, and that the collective community remained strong in the face of adversity. Shelter, too, became a shared concern. When storms battered the plains, cabins were hastily reinforced with borrowed timber. Thatched roofs were patched with materials offered by neighbors, and temporary housing might be extended to those whose homes had been damaged or destroyed, creating a fluid sense of property and ownership that prioritized survival over individual claim. Because in these conditions, the safety of the collective often outweighed personal boundaries. Families learned to coordinate labor, alternating shifts in tending livestock, chopping wood, or drawing water, recognizing that pooling their energy not only increased efficiency, but also created a buffer against exhaustion, injury, or unexpected calamities that might otherwise overwhelm a single household. Protection was another dimension of this interdependence, perhaps the most acute in moments of danger, because the frontier was rarely forgiving, and threats from wildlife prowling in the night to the occasional band of outlaws or unpredictable human conflict required coordinated vigilance. Neighbors patrolled trails, formed makeshift militias, and kept watch over one another's property, understanding intuitively that a single lapse could endanger not just one family, but the entire cluster of homes and lives linked by proximity and mutual care. In essence, survival was a shared responsibility, and the social fabric of these settlements was stitched together with countless acts of cooperation, generosity, and solidarity, where every loaned tool, every shared meal, and every watchful eye strengthened a network that could turn vulnerability into resilience, uncertainty into relative security, and isolation into a... Even amid the relentless challenges of disease, injury, unpredictable weather, scarce food, and the ever-present threats of human and natural danger. Pioneers consistently demonstrated a level of resilience that seems almost unimaginable by modern standards. Quote, survival on the frontier demanded not just physical strength, but an unyielding mental fortitude and the capacity to adapt to conditions that shifted with astonishing unpredictability. It's transforming every day into a test of endurance, ingenuity, and perseverance. These men and women rose before dawn to tend to chores that spanned the full spectrum of labor, plowing fields in soil that resisted cultivation, chopping firewood to stave off freezing nights, tending livestock exposed to predators, and hunting in unfamiliar terrain for the sustenance that would see their families through the next week call, while carrying the emotional weight of isolation, constant danger, and uncertainty about the future. A combination of pressures that would have overwhelmed anyone unaccustomed to such a life. Resilience was cultivated through routine, improvisation, and an intimate knowledge of the land. Because the frontier offered no second chances and a few external supports, it's compelling pioneers to master skills that extended from practical mechanics to herbal medicine, from navigation to self-defense, and from food preservation to the delicate art of negotiation with neighbors, traders, and sometimes wary Native American communities. Their ingenuity was apparent in the construction of homes capable of withstanding the most severe storms, the improvisation of tools and shelter from limited materials, and the creative strategies developed to store and ration food when drought, flood, or crop failure threatened their survival, reflecting a resourcefulness born of necessity rather than choice. Beyond practical skills, emotional and psychological resilience became equally critical. Pioneers confronted the daily grind of uncertainty, the loss of loved ones, and the frustration of unending labor that often seemed to produce only incremental results. Stories passed down through generations speak of families who survived brutal winters with near starvation, diets, miners who returned from hazardous claims with only the faint hope of striking gold, and settlers who rebuilt homes or entire farms after floods, fires, or violent conflicts, exemplifying a tenacity that was as much about willpower as it was. Life on the frontier was a relentless teacher, and it quickly became evident that survival demanded a combination of toughness, adaptability, and an almost instinctual awareness of the world's unpredictable rhythms, because the Wild West offered no grace periods, no guarantees, and no safety nets. Every sunrise marked the beginning of a series of challenges that required mental sharpness as much as physical endurance, and those who underestimated the demands of their environment often found themselves overwhelmed by forces both human and natural. From the moment one stepped out of a modest cabin into the raw expanse of plains, mountains, or desert, the pioneer was confronted with a landscape that tested every skill they possessed, from identifying edible plants and predicting weather shifts to improvising shelter from the materials at hand and navigating trails that could vanish in storms or be obstructed by fallen trees, flooding rivers, or treacherous terrain, all while maintaining vigilance against predators and opportunistic humans who saw the vulnerability of isolated settlers as an invitation. Toughness was more than physical stamina. It encompassed the fortitude to endure hardship without despair, the patience to engage in labor that often yielded minimal reward, and the capacity to recover from setbacks that could strike without warning. Whether the sudden loss of livestock to disease or predators, the destruction of a crop by drought, or the collapse of a mining claim after weeks of grueling effort, adaptability was equally crucial, demanding creativity and flexibility in confronting new and unfamiliar situations. Learning to repair broken tools with whatever scraps were available, modifying daily routines to accommodate unexpected weather, negotiating disputes with neighbors or traveling parties, and absorbing sense from repeated mistakes without succumbing to frustration or defeat. Every aspect of frontier life required a constant balancing act between persistence and prudence, courage and caution, because a single miscalculation, poorly judged river crossing, a misidentified plant, or a delayed response to the approach of outlaws could have catastrophic consequences. Time, not only for the individual, but for their family, and, in many cases, for the broader community that depended on mutual support. This ceaseless, in the relentless rhythm of frontier life, the notion of leisure was nearly non-existent, replaced instead by a ceaseless cycle of labor that defined every waking hour, because, in the Wild West, survival was a task that demanded unwavering dedication, skill, and physical endurance, and even the simplest comforts of modern life, reliable food, warm clothing, secure shelter, had to be earned through sweat, ingenuity, and unbroken effort. From the break of dawn, settlers would rise to confront chores that spanned an extraordinary range of responsibilities, tending to livestock that required constant attention, repairing structures battered by wind or rain, hauling water from distant streams, preparing meals with limited ingredients, and ensuring that crops were cultivated despite the ever-present threats of drought, pests, or soil that resisted all attempts at cultivation. Each task, no matter how routine it might appear, carried weight, because a neglected field could mean hunger, a poorly tended herd could mean loss of livelihood, and a house left unrepaired could mean exposure to the harshest elements. And in such a world, efficiency, diligence, and endurance were not merely virtues. They were survival skills as critical as knowing how to hunt or navigate treacherous terrain. Hard work extended beyond physical labor to include the constant mental and strategic effort required to manage risk, anticipate challenges, and innovate solutions with limited resources. Miners spent long, grueling days in shafts that were dark, damp, and unstable, constantly calculating how to extract ore without collapsing tunnels or succumbing to the deadly combination of dust, heat, and exhaustion. Farmers balanced the demands of planting, irrigation, and harvesting with the unpredictability of weather, learning to read subtle signs in the soil, the sky, and the surrounding landscape, while ranchers navigated the management of large herds across sprawling, unpatrolled territory, remaining vigilant against disease, theft, and predator attacks. Even domestic work, cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, preserving food for long winters, was physically demanding, requiring stamina, foresight, meticulous attention. While popular culture has immortalized the cowboy as a figure of freedom, rugged individualism, and effortless charm, the reality behind this iconic image was far harsher, steeped in relentless labor, constant danger, and a kind of physical and emotional endurance that modern audiences rarely associate with the stereotypical silver screen hero. Because the day-to-day existence of cowboys was a ceaseless struggle against elements, animals, and exhaustion, were long hours in the saddle, exposed to sun, wind, and rain. And the unforgiving demands of cattle drives tested not only muscles and stamina, but patience, judgment, and resilience. Unlike the carefully choreographed duels and glamorous escapades portrayed in movies, the frontier cowboy's life was grounded in practicality, necessity, and survival, shaped by a relentless cycle of tasks that required attention, skill, and an almost preternatural awareness of the landscape, livestock, and weather patterns, because one missed detail could mean injury, loss of animals, or even death. From the crack of dawn until dusk, cowboys rode across vast stretches of prairie mountains in desert, guiding herds of cattle through rugged terrain that often offered no clear path, contending with unpredictable rivers, hidden ravines, and dense forests that could turn a routine drive into a trial of ingenuity and endurance. While the constant threat of stampedes, predatory animals, the simple mechanical dangers of handling massive, powerful animals added a layer of tension that demanded unwavering focus and skill. Nights offered little respite as cowboys took turns guarding the herd, tending to injuries, and maintaining the equipment that could mean life or death on the trail, all while enduring uncomfortable weather, limited food, and minimal shelter, often in the open under skies that ranged from blistering sun to freezing cold. Beyond the physical trials, the cowboy's existence demanded mental fortitude, because the monotony of riding for hours interspersed with bursts of chaos, the responsibility of managing large groups of unpredictable animals, and the isolation from community or family created a cycle. As the tales of the Wild West spread eastward and eventually around the world, a shimmering mythology took root, casting cowboys, gunslingers, and pioneers as symbols of unbridled freedom, fearless adventure, and individual triumph. Yet, beneath this golden glow lay the harsh, often overlooked realities of suffering, labor, and constant danger that defined everyday life on the frontier, because while the stories celebrated daring deeds and moments of daring heroism, they rarely conveyed the unrelenting toil, the injuries that festered without proper care, the relentless exposure to storms and scorching sun, and the emotional weight of isolation and uncertainty that shaped the true experience of those who lived in these unforgiving lands. This romanticized vision created a cultural shorthand that equated courage with glory, independence with ease, and venture with excitement, obscuring the truth that survival demanded tireless effort, unyielding vigilance, and the constant negotiation between human endurance and the unpredictable whims of nature, animals, and the landscape itself. The gap between legend and reality was not just a matter of dramatization for entertainment. It shaped perceptions of the American frontier for generations, influencing literature, art, and popular imagination, while leaving the stories of suffering, resilience, and community largely untold. Because the public appetite for tales of freedom and heroism naturally eclipsed narratives of hunger, illness, and exhaustion. In truth, the frontier was a place where every choice mattered, where a single misstep could mean injury or death, where children grew up quickly learning to shoulder responsibilities that modern societies would consider extraordinary, and where families confronted daily hardships that eroded hope, even as they built the foundations for survival, community, and eventual prosperity. Yet, the allure of the Wild West legend persisted, because human beings are drawn to stories of courage and adventure, and the harshness of reality, though omnipresent, was often sanitized or overlooked in the telling, leaving behind an image that was aspirational, cinematic, and deeply compelling, yet only long before settlers arrived with their wagons, rifles, and dreams of fortune. The land that would come to be known as the Wild West was shaped, sustained, and revered by Native American cultures whose deep understanding of the terrain, seasons, and natural resources had been cultivated over centuries, creating societies that were intricately connected to the rhythms of the land and to each other in ways that early settlers often overlooked, misunderstood, or dismissed. Yet, these connections provided the foundation upon which survival, trade, and knowledge could flourish. The presence of native communities was not merely a backdrop to the expansion of the frontier. They were active stewards of the land, managing game populations, cultivating crops, and guiding travelers through treacherous passes and arid plains, sharing expertise that could mean the difference between life and death for those willing to listen, learn, and respect the wisdom embedded in their traditions. For generations, Native Americans had developed sustainable practices attuned to the cycles of water, soil, and animal populations, and they possessed intricate social, spiritual, and economic systems that connected communities across vast regions, allowing knowledge, resources, and cultural practices to be shared, adapted, and preserved. Their histories are rich with stories of adaptation, resilience, and diplomacy. As they navigated shifting alliances, the arrival of European settlers, and the profound upheavals brought by trade, territorial pressures, and eventual military conflicts, demonstrating that the history of the West was never solely a tale of settlers and cowboys, but a tapestry woven from the experiences, decisions, and knowledge of multiple peoples living in and shaping the same environment. When settlers first traversed these lands, the guidance, hospitality, and trade networks offered by native communities often proved essential to survival, whether through the sharing of food, the teaching of hunting and tracking techniques, or advice on navigating unfamiliar landscapes. Yet, these vital contributions were frequently unacknowledged in the stories and myths that would later, as settlers pushed further westward, drawn by the promise of land, wealth, and opportunity. The expansion of the frontier came with consequences that were profound, often devastating, and rarely reflected in the romanticized stories that would later dominate popular imagination, because the pursuit of progress and settlement frequently collided with the established lives, sacred lands, and enduring traditions of indigenous peoples, resulting in displacement, cultural upheaval, and loss that reshaped the very fabric of the region. Every homestead claimed, every town established, and every railroad laid was not merely a triumph of human perseverance, but also a disruption to communities that had lived, hunted, farmed, and governed themselves according to deeply rooted systems for generations. And these incursions often brought with them violence, disease, and legal measures designed to restrict the freedom and sovereignty of native nations. The human cost of expansion was staggering, as families were uprooted, sacred sites desecrated, and survival itself became a daily struggle under the pressures of confinement, starvation, and military campaigns that sought to remove resistance or enforce compliance with newly imposed laws and treaties, many of which were negotiated under duress or later broken entirely. Indigenous knowledge systems, languages, and cultural practices were systematically undermined as boarding schools, forced relocations, and restrictive policies sought to erase centuries of heritage, leaving scars that echoed across generations and reshaped the social and spiritual landscapes of entire regions. At the same time, settler narratives often framed these transformations as inevitable progress, framing survival, adaptation, and industriousness on the frontier as heroic, while largely ignoring or minimizing the suffering and resilience of the original inhabitants, whose lives were irrevocably altered. Yet even amidst such upheaval, indigenous communities exhibited remarkable resilience, preserving languages, traditions, and cultural practices, wherever possible adapting strategies of diplomacy, resistance, and negotiation to safeguard their people and their knowledge, while maintaining a deep spiritual connection to lands that were central to their identity and survival. These stories of endurance, however, were seldom recorded in the same way as the tales of cowboys amid the tension, upheaval, and displacement that defined the westward expansion. Settlers often found themselves confronted with a stark and inescapable truth. The land was unforgiving and without guidance. Survival was far from guaranteed, and it was in this crucible of necessity that many began to recognize the wisdom embedded in native communities' long-standing knowledge of the environment. For generations, indigenous peoples had learned to read the subtle signs of the seasons, track the movements of game, locate hidden sources of water, and harness the land's resources in ways that ensured sustainability, continuity, and resilience. And those who were willing to observe, listen, and adapt often found that survival hinged on embracing techniques and strategies that were foreign to their prior experiences in more settled regions. Settlers learned to construct shelters that could withstand harsh winters and scorching summers, adopting building methods, insulation practices, and site selections informed by centuries of local knowledge, while hunting strategies, from tracking animals to understanding migratory patterns and foraging for edible plants, came crucial skills that blended necessity with innovation. It's because a misstep in judgment could leave a family without food or exposed to predators, forcing hard lessons in endurance and adaptability. Even methods of preserving food, smoking, drying, or salting meat were refined through observation and experimentation, often drawing on practices that native communities had developed to ensure nourishment throughout long, unpredictable seasons, highlighting the practical, experiential wisdom embedded in these centuries-old traditions. Water, always scarce and often elusive, became a focal point for adaptation, as settlers learned to locate natural springs, dig wells in strategic locations, and purify what they could gather, employing knowledge passed on by native guides who understood the nuances of aquifers, seasonal runoff, and the indicators of safe drinking sources. 'Cause, in the vast deserts, plains, and rugged mountains, a single miscalculation could prove fatal. Additionally, understanding the land's natural hazards, from snakes and predators to weather patterns and fire risks, became a matter of life and death, requiring settlers to incorporate observation, timing, and caution into their daily routines in ways that mirrored indigenous practices, demonstrating that survival was not merely a matter of brute strength or determination, but of knowledge, strategy, and careful attention to the rhythms of the environment. While popular imagination often casts the frontier as a domain dominated solely by rugged men on horseback, guiding herds or facing outlaws, the cause reality was that women were indispensable to the very survival of families and communities, their labor, ingenuity, and resilience forming the backbone of frontier life in ways that were rarely acknowledged in romanticized depictions of the West. Because every homestead, farm, and mining camp relied on their tireless efforts to sustain basic necessities, preserve food, care for the sick and injured, educate children, and maintain social cohesion, the circumstances that demanded both physical endurance and extraordinary mental fortitude. Frontier women were often up before sunrise and worked until long after sunset, performing tasks that today might be divided among dozens of specialized roles. Yet, they accomplished them with little support, limited tools, and the ever-present pressures of an unpredictable environment where drought, disease, and accidents could quickly escalate into crises that threatened the entire household. Their work extended far beyond domestic duties, encompassing the cultivation of crops in often poor soil, the tending of livestock through harsh seasons, and the construction or maintenance of buildings and fences, all while navigating social expectations and the limitations imposed by law and custom, which frequently denied them formal recognition, property rights, or political agency. Yet these same women developed expertise, strategy, and resilience that were crucial to ensuring the survival and prosperity of the frontier community. They were the planners, the first responders, the caregivers, and, at times, the defenders of their families, adapting skills from both necessity and observation, whether learning to forage for edible plants, manage scarce water resources, treat injuries with rudimentary medical knowledge, or negotiate with neighbors and local authorities to secure safety. Life on the frontier spared no one from its relentless demands, and children, far from enjoying the prolonged childhoods that modern societies often take for granted, were thrust into roles and responsibilities that shaped not only their daily existence, but their very understanding of survival. Because, in a world where every mouth to feed and every task mattered, even the youngest hands were expected to contribute meaningfully to the family's welfare, often balancing chores that would be considered arduous, even for adults, alongside the limited education or play that their circumstances allowed. From the moment they could walk, children were taught to tend animals, fetch water from distant streams, chop wood for the stove, gather firewood or forage for food, and assist with planting and harvesting crops, all while absorbing lessons in navigation, weather prediction, and practical problem solving that were essential to ensuring not just their own survival, but that of their family and neighbors. The frontier demanded that children develop resilience, self-reliance, practical skills far earlier than would be expected in more settled regions, because mistakes could have immediate and severe consequences. A mismanaged fire could destroy a home. A misjudged crossing of a river could result in drowning, and a neglected herd could mean famine, leaving no room for inexperience or idleness. Education, when it existed, was often intertwined with labor, as reading, writing, and arithmetic were taught alongside the mechanics of farming, the intricacies of animal care, and the principles of food preservation, blending survival skills with formal learning in a way that produced young people who were simultaneously practical, resourceful, and disciplined. In addition to physical labor, frontier children contributed emotionally and socially to the household. As the frontier slowly transformed under the tireless labor ingenuity and resilience of settlers, women, and children alike. The Wild West began to emerge, not just as a physical space, but as a cultural touchstone, laying the foundation for a distinctly American identity that would endure long after the last wagon trails faded and the railroads stitched the vast landscapes together, because the stories, values, and struggles of the frontier were woven into the national consciousness, shaping ideas about courage, self-reliance, independence, and the pursuit of opportunity in ways that would resonate across generations. This identity, however, was far more complex and multifaceted than the simple myths of gunslinging cowboys and lawless towns. It was grounded in the lived experiences of real people facing constant hardship, adapting to unforgiving landscapes, negotiating conflicts, finding ways to survive and thrive where resources were scarce and danger was ever present. The Wild West came to symbolize a narrative of freedom and possibility, where individuals, through determination, skill, and sometimes sheer luck, could carve out livelihoods and communities from seemingly unyielding land. And these stories of perseverance became embedded in literature, music, folklore, and later, film and television, providing the cultural scaffolding upon which generations of Americans would understand and mythologize themselves. Yet, beneath the surface of these tales lay the truths of cooperation, cultural exchange, and collective endurance, including the knowledge shared by native communities, the tireless contributions of women, the labor of children, and the sacrifices and risks endured by all who inhabited the frontier. Moreover, the ethos of the Wild West, the embrace of challenge, the necessity of adaptability, the value of resilience in the face of uncertainty, helped shape not only individual character, ideals, but also broader societal narratives about the American spirit, reinforcing notions of independence, ingenuity, and the moral significance of hard work, while simultaneously obscuring some of the harsher realities, such as displacement of indigenous peoples, environmental strain, and the daily hardships faced by families and communities striving to survive in a land that offered both promise and peril in equal measure. These cultural narratives, perpetuated through storytelling, media, and education, solidified the West as a symbol of possibility and identity, turning the frontier into both a real and imagined space where American ideals, freedom, opportunity, resilience, and community were enacted, celebrated, and sometimes contested, creating a powerful foundation for national self-understanding that continues to influence perceptions of history, culture, and character. By examining the Wild West not only as a stage for adventure and conflict, but as a crucible in which values, practices, and collective memories were forged, we gain a deeper appreciation for how this era became central to the American imagination, influencing art, literature, popular culture, and even contemporary attitudes toward risk, work, and community, reminding us that the myths and legends of the frontier, while partially romanticized, are inseparable from the real lives, challenges, and triumphs of those who inhabited it, and that the cultural identity derived from this period is both a reflection of human resilience and a lens through which subsequent generations interpret freedom, survival, and the meaning of opportunity. even as the frontier itself has long since been tamed, settled, and transformed by cities, highways, and modern technology. The lessons learned from the harsh realities of life on the Wild West continue to resonate, offering insights into resilience, adaptability, and the human capacity to endure extreme hardship, because the skills, strategies, and attitudes forged in a world where every day presented a new challenge are timeless in their relevance, reminding us that preparation, ingenuity, cooperation are not merely historical artifacts, but enduring guides for navigating both literal and metaphorical wildernesses in our own lives. From the careful planning required to secure food, water, and shelter, to the keen observation and problem solving that allowed settlers to anticipate weather, track animals, or repair broken equipment under pressure. The frontier instilled a mindset of resourcefulness and ingenuity that transcends centuries, teaching that survival is as much about creativity, learning, and persistence as it is about raw physical strength. Beyond practical skills, the era imparted lessons in community and interdependence that remain vital today. Because while individual courage was celebrated, the stories of settlers, native communities, and frontier families demonstrate that mutual aid, shared knowledge, and collaborative problem-solving were often the difference between life and death, emphasizing that resilience is inseparable from relationships and collective effort, and that human ingenuity flourishes most when people work together to overcome challenges that are too great for any one individual to face alone. Even contemporary adventurers, entrepreneurs, and educators draw inspiration from these examples, recognizing that the discipline, patience, and foresight exhibited by frontier community skills honed in response to scarcity, danger, and uncertainty are directly applicable to navigating modern challenges, whether in personal growth, business strategy, or environmental stewardship. Moreover, the moral and psychological lessons of the era continue to inform our understanding of courage, persistence, and adaptability, because the Wild West was not only a landscape of physical trial, but also a crucible of human character, where patience, prudence, creativity were essential to surviving isolation, adversity, and the unpredictability of both nature and human conflict. And in studying these experiences, we gain a framework for cultivating resilience in our own lives, appreciating that the greatest accomplishments often emerge from sustained effort under difficult circumstances, and that triumph, while celebrated in legend, is always grounded in the disciplined, relentless work of ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances. By reflecting on these survival lessons, we are reminded that history is more than a collection of dates or myths. It is a repository of lived experience, providing guidance, inspiration, and perspective for contemporary challenges, and that the endurance, adaptability, and ingenuity of frontier communities offer a model for approaching uncertainty, hardship, and opportunity in ways that remain as relevant now as they were over a century ago, proving that the spirit of the Wild West, the combination of courage, resourcefulness, cooperation, continues to shape not only our cultural imagination, but also the principles by which we confront our own modern frontiers. When we strip away the Hollywood glamour of dramatic showdowns, saloon duels, and lone heroes riding into the sunset, the reality of the Wild West emerges as something far more demanding, far more relentless, and far more human than the myths suggest, because the essence of survival in that era was not measured in moments of daring bravery or cinematic heroics, but in the quiet, unglamorous perseverance required to meet the endless cascade of daily challenges that could claim life, health, or livelihood with shocking speed. It was endurance that defined success, whether that meant rising before dawn to tend crops or livestock, patching a roof under the weight of snow, nursing a sick child with rudimentary remedies, or traversing miles of rugged terrain while anticipating every conceivable hazard, from sudden storms to broken wagons, from disease to the constant threat of predators. The frontier demanded not just physical stamina, but mental resilience. Because life unfolded in an environment where unpredictability was the only constant. And every decision, no matter how small, carried consequences that could ripple through days or weeks. Determining whether a family went hungry, a settlement survived, or a journey ended tragically. Endurance took many forms. The ability to remain steadfast in the face of scarcity, to continue working despite exhaustion, to adapt strategies when crops failed or water ran dry, and to persist in maintaining hope and cohesion when isolation, fear, and hardship threatened to overwhelm. It was endurance that shaped character, forged community bonds, and allowed families to carve out livable spaces in landscapes that offered no guarantees and demanded maximum effort for the most modest rewards. The narrative of glory, adventure, and instant fame often overshadows these fundamental truths, yet the settlers, native guides, women and children who populated the West understood that survival was rarely about dramatic acts or public recognition. It was about waking each day with resolve, meeting necessity with ingenuity, and continually navigating an environment that tested the limits of human capability, sometimes with devastating consequences. Their achievements, therefore, are better measured not by legendary feats or sensational stories, but by the cumulative impact of countless small acts of endurance, feeding a family during a drought, nursing a wounded neighbor back to health, repairing tools in freezing temperatures, and enduring relentless uncertainty with courage and pragmatism. In truth, the enduring fascination with the Wild West lies in the contrast between these legendary myths and the tangible reality of human perseverance. Because when we examine the historical record, we see that the West was won not by bravado alone, by the sustained effort, resilience, and adaptability of ordinary people confronting extraordinary circumstances. And it is this aspect, the quiet heroism of enduring and thriving against unrelenting adversity, that continues to inspire us today, reminding us that real achievement is often measured not in spectacle, but in the capacity to persist, adapt, and overcome the relentless challenges that life, whether on the frontier or in our modern world, inevitably presents. As we reflect on the sweeping panorama of the Wild West, it becomes clear that this era, often mythologized in film and fiction, was far less about dramatic duels at high noon or effortless adventure, and far more about an unyielding struggle for survival. A constant negotiation with a landscape that offered beauty and peril in equal measure, and a daily test of human resilience and ingenuity that few could endure without developing extraordinary resourcefulness, courage, and adaptability. Because every moment of life on the frontier, from waking to the cries of the wind across the plains to the dim glow of a quiet fire in the evening, was shaped by the relentless demands of nature, the scarcity of resources, and the complexity of human relationships within often isolated and unpredictable communities. The Wild West symbolized freedom, risk, and resilience, yes, but it also demanded an intimate understanding of the harsh realities of existence, where deserts made water precious, mountains and storms posed life-threatening obstacles, and food, when available at all, required skill, patience, and sometimes sheer luck to obtain or preserve. Settlers quickly learned that survival was not a romantic notion, but a matter of practical action. Whether it was hunting game in unforgiving terrain, farming stubborn soil during periods of drought, or navigating the unpredictable behavior of weather that could swing from blistering heat to sudden snowstorms capable of burying homes and roads alike. Illness and injury were constant threats. Diseases such as smallpox, cholera, or typhoid could sweep through a town with terrifying speed, and a seemingly minor wound could become fatal without access to proper medical care. While violent conflicts between settlers, outlaws, sometimes Native American groups, added an unpredictable human element that demanded vigilance, courage, and frequently the presence of firearms for protection. Because in this world, readiness and prudence were inseparable from daily survival. Yet, despite these hardships, the frontier was also a crucible of innovation and community. where neighbors relied on one another, not only for safety, but for sustenance, support, and shared knowledge. Families, children, and women all played indispensable roles. Children undertook adult responsibilities from an early age, learning skills and cultivating resilience that would carry them through harsh winters, droughts, and perilous journeys, while women contributed tirelessly to food preparation, clothing production, and the management of households that were simultaneously homes, workplaces, and fortresses against both natural and human threats. Community bonds were not merely social niceties, they were essential lifelines, because cooperation and mutual aid often meant the difference between life and death in a landscape that afforded no margin for error. Amid this relentless toil, settlers also absorbed and adapted survival techniques from native communities, learning to track animals, anticipate weather patterns, cultivate crops suited to arid soils, and navigate a world that required constant ingenuity. The romanticized cowboy image, with its veneer of glory and freedom, obscures these truths, masking the grueling labor, constant vigilance, and endurance required to maintain a foothold in such a demanding environment. Even mining and ranching, industries often associated with wealth and prosperity, were dominated by long hours, physical exhaustion, and significant risk, demonstrating that opportunity in the West was inseparable from relentless effort and courage under pressure. Through all of this, the Wild West became more than a historical moment. It became a foundation for American cultural identity. Its stories of risk, resilience, and perseverance shaped the values and imagination of generations, embedding lessons of resourcefulness, courage, and adaptability that continue to inspire people today. The endurance of settlers, the cooperation within communities, and the ingenuity required to survive against relentless challenges remain powerful reminders that real heroism is often quiet, cumulative, and grounded in the ability to persevere when the world seems indifferent or hostile. In the end, the true legacy of the Wild West is not found in the dramatized gunfights or cinematic legends, but in the human spirit that allowed ordinary people, men, women, and children alike, to confront extraordinary circumstances with determination, skill, and courage, forging lives, communities, and traditions that would echo through history long after the last frontier wagon disappeared from the horizon. The story of the Wild West is ultimately a story of endurance, of human beings meeting relentless challenges with creativity and grit, of lives lived at the intersection of risk and resilience, and of the timeless lessons that remind us all how much can be achieved when courage, ingenuity, and cooperation guide our every step. So tonight, as you lay down and let the quiet settle around you, take a moment to reflect on the endurance, resourcefulness, courage of those who carved out a life where survival was never guaranteed, and let their stories remind you of the strength that lies within each of us when faced with challenges, however daunting. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry a little of that frontier spirit with you, calm, resilient, and ready to face whatever tomorrow brings. Good night.